diversity is very key, I think, to creating a certain environment in which we're able to question a lot of the boundaries that are drawn between people.
And another important thing that our work in these kind of areas can bring to our understanding of how, you know, society and the world works today is just the kind of recognition of different perspectives.
I never collaborate directly in my creative writing, but in my academic writing I have collaborators. I just don't ever want to write on my own again. It's lonely and it's hard. But working with collaborators, you know, it brings out the best in all of you, because, you know, you might be trying to impress each other or to help each other, or so it's again, it's a really human thing to do, to collaborate. And certainly in terms of creativity, I'm not the first person to say it. There are a range of theorists who talk about it, but that paradigm of it being just sort of like the solitary individual who is the creator has been thoroughly debunked by sociology, by cultural psychology. It's actually not how it happens. And anybody who thinks that they are writing in isolation and then bringing it to the world, you know, they're wrong. Everything along, Howard Becker in his book Art Worlds gives this marvellous example of Anthony Trollope, who once said he should perhaps thank his groom for his career, because every morning at 5 a.m. he brought me my coffee and got me out of bed and writing. And it is even at that level, those kind of little micro relationships that impact and support creative work. So.
Being aware of the different perspectives is really important, because then I know that there are other ways of doing things, not simply the way that I may have been taught to do it, but there are other approaches that could be taken advantage of to get the most out of a particular piece of evidence.
Just recently we've had the attempt to bring back in a kind of a language proficiency requirement for citizenship, and you know, that's one recent political example. Now that failed in the Parliament, but equally the debates we've been having this year about you know, diverse citizenship of parliamentary members, you know, and the conversation is there, and you know, particularly after the High Court decision, the conversation now is, well, you know, 50% of Australians have a parent who was born somewhere else, so why is this a barrier to parliamentary representation? Which is, you know, it's kind of the conversation I thought we should have had at the beginning rather than the end. You know, like, this is one of Australia's strengths, that we have people who know about more than just Australia. Why are we having a conversation which is about limiting that diversity?
But putting the disciplines in contact with one another and being open enough to see where the surfaces of, you know, contact might be is very important for the health of the discipline, so that not only do we ride the boundaries looking for people trying to escape, but we should be riding the boundaries with a kind of a little binoculars or kind of a directional mic, you know, trying to hear what's going on in the next discipline over and see whether or not we can use it to inform our own work, and then see if we can persuade others to accept that as a valid contribution to scholarship in our own area.
So I'm originally from South Africa. I grew up during the end of apartheid. I was at high school and at university when everything changed, and so there was this kind of, I was coming of age as this new democracy was coming of age. Diversity and race relations were at the heart of everything that we did. The conversations that we were having as 14-year-olds were, now I realize, quite sophisticated. So when I came here in my early 20s, when I enrolled at UQ, my initial response was I was engulfed by whiteness, and I didn't quite know how to handle that as a white person. I wasn't used to being engulfed by whiteness in this sense. That then developed into PhD research. How we frame diversity in Australia is really difficult, because as teachers, for me, my role is attempting to get students to learn about structural oppression and to understand how the structures in which we are embedded exclude the ability to have conversations about race and gender. or raise the ability to have conversations about race and gender.
The way that I think about this is in terms of when you think about interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, you need to start at the discipline. That the disciplines, what tools do the disciplines provide that are actually useful that will add something to the actual project that you're doing. So if you want to think about, say, if you want to do something like I'm doing, like you want to write a history of human rights, you want to put a history of human rights together, then you might want to draw on people from literary studies, you might want to draw on people from political science, obviously from straight history, and many other fields. But I guess what you've got to do is start at your discipline's level. What can your discipline add, rather than saying, oh, this is a really interesting, I suppose one approach you could take would be to say, human rights, this is really interesting. Let's all sit in a room together and we'll all think about human rights in different ways, but we'll end up with kind of a mishmash of different theories and approaches, of different ideas. Well, what we should maybe be doing is starting at the disciplinary level, doing some thinking there, and trying to use that disciplinary knowledge, I suppose, to then bringing that to the table, I mean, like, this is what we would make sense of this, and then seeing how those tools fit together. Maybe certain aspects of a historian's understanding could really better reflect, say, a discussion over in political science about questions like responsibility to protect, for example.
I mean, these disciplinary boundaries are always really porous. So one thing I'm working on now is, in addition to the health sociology, I'm an emotions sociologist. So a key kind of theoretical thread within the sociology of emotions is Hochschild's theory of emotion management. And she really, in the late 70s, early 80s, drew on a kind of understanding of emotions in work as a form of performance. And that's something from Irving Goffman as well, this dramaturgical approach to sociology, that we're all managing impressions and presenting ourselves in a certain way to comply with certain role expectations. And Hochschild kind of took that further to say to comply with certain feeling expectations as well. So in some ways, the training in acting theory, however limited it was, considering I didn't finish, the major, has been informative in an understanding of emotions as performance, and in kind of critiquing some of the conceptualizations of emotions as performance. My work is interdisciplinary on a range of different levels. In terms of the health sociology and focusing on interprofessional education, what I bring to the teams that I've worked with on the topic of interprofessional education is a sociological lens and expertise within qualitative research and sociology of emotions. So that's often kind of appreciated as something distinct from the professional offerings of a clinical educator or a lecturer in, say, physiotherapy or speech pathology. In other contexts, when I'm thinking about the sociology of emotions and theorizing there, we see interdisciplinarity as something that's being called for within that discipline. So we see a lot of theoretical drive coming from more the humanities side. So cultural theory, Deleuze and Guattari and Masumi's concepts of affect, as well as, say, on the social psychology, the even neuroscience side calls for a stronger engagement with the biological, as well as the cultural and the kind of pre-personal elements of emotions. So it certainly is unavoidable in my work. I would conceptualize interdisciplinary as different professions often kind of coming together for, and this is based on, I think Barry and colleagues did an article on it in 2008. They talk about different kinds of logics of interdisciplinarity, but I think the most prominent one is different discrete professions kind of coming together to solve a specific problem. And sometimes that can mean that a new kind of discipline is formed. Sometimes it can mean that a more kind of powerful discipline subsumes that less powerful discipline into that process. In interprofessional practice, it's about these different, and it's used, I think, almost exclusively in health, but these different professions working alongside but also across disciplinary lines to achieve a particular kind of health outcome. So there is some debate about the extent to which they are complementary or diverging, but interprofessional practice kind of highlights the blurring and the role sharing that happens, though we don't see the creation of a kind of new, say, discipline. We may see, and this is something that I argued in a paper that was published this year, we do see with interprofessional education the production of new kind of ontological subjects that see themselves as not just part of a discrete profession, but as valuing and ready for that role blurring and sharing.
Well, the thing I think is fantastic about the interdisciplinarity is that while it's appeared to be an impediment at the time, you know, I was a music person and I was also in history, so undergraduate was in music, postgraduate in history. I thought, oh, this is really difficult. But what happened for me was I brought what you'd call a distinctly original approach to things, which was great. And secondly, I was employed in both music faculties and history schools over my career. So I've worked at 3 universities in Australia in music schools and in history schools. So that meant somewhere along the line I was being frighteningly relevant to someone in those disciplines, even if I felt at the time I was a bit of an imposter because I wasn't wholly one or the other. So I would strongly advise that. You know, example, I worked at QUT, right, amongst a whole lot of 20th and 21st century musicians, right, hip hop, techno, the whole lot. It was one of the most remarkable educations I'd had because I came from a classical background, early music, all this sort of stuff, you know, the canon, and these were just different canons. And I worked with a chap called Andy Arthurs, who was professor at that time, and he'd done sound mixing for the Beatles. So there was this kind of amazing place, but I learnt so much from him and another chap called Richard Vella, who came and was a visiting professor who was just fantastic. And they revolutionised the way I thought about music, and in a way said to me, it's okay to be different because we're all different here, you know, and there are these kind of inclusions and exclusions that occur. And it was working with them as this kind of oddball who then suddenly, you know, found these amazing projects on musical literacy, which demonstrated to me that there's a great deal of importance placed on being able to read and write musical notation. But what I was seeing in the classrooms was incredible musical innovation that did not require that. That was just something you could do, but it didn't guarantee the creativity. And in fact, the creativity occurred in amazing ways. So we had one bunch of kids who ended up doing a piece for a BMW ad. They wrote the track for the BMW ad. But the funny part was when the discussion came round with us, they said, oh, Dolly, we've done that. I said, that's fantastic. How much did you get paid for it? They said, $500. I said, $500? That's ridiculous. You needed to be paid $5,000. It's BMW, for God's sake. So, you know, so there is that kind of funny thing about just how exposure to different things develops you in different ways. And I have an inquiring mind, you know, where I sit there thinking, oh, that's interesting. I'll go to a gallery or I'll go somewhere and I'll look at something and go, oh, why is that happening? So that kind of thing, I think, is what interdisciplinarity genuinely will develop in people. The capacity to say, you know, but why? Why is this so? So finally when someone said to me, I'm an intellectual historian, I said, well, we all have our crosses to bear. I thought, because really it's just another pigeonholing of stuff. And when you pigeonhole, you exclude. And when you exclude, you shut down the capacity to be open to an alternate view of the world and an answer that you may not even have thought of. And that's, I think, one of the things I can't abide in historians and musicologists, is they will give you the answer to a question they haven't had the imagination to ask. So they shut you down before you've even started. You know, telling people that these areas of study are not of interest, not of value because they don't fit what's already there. I think we really have to think about that because, you know, the 19th century is responsible for a lot of what we've got now. But how relevant is that? How inclusive is that? And I think for me, there's a fundamental desire to democratise the past, because if we do that, we democratise the present.